Harold Price thought he could build a family out of the dead. John Murphy believed he could keep his together forever. Clyde Rowe turned the sound of his victims' fear into music. Gerald Tuck collected strangers like photographs, watching them sleep through the walls. And Pastor Elijah Crane buried his congregation's secrets beneath the snow. Each man believed he was preserving something sacred, but what they left behind was too disturbing for even Netflix to tell. In 1999, deep in the wooded outskirts of Idaho, a smell led two hikers to something that would haunt the local sheriff's department for decades. They thought it was just an animal carcass, but when officers arrived and broke open the padlocked cabin, the air that poured out was thick and sour, like death and rot layered over years of silence. The inside of the cabin looked like time had stopped. Dust hung in the air, furniture was covered with plastic, and the windows were sealed shut with boards and duct tape. But what caught their attention most was the far corner of the main room. A wooden door with no knob, chained from the outside. When they broke it open, their flashlights illuminated a room that looked like a scene from a nightmare. There were 7 mannequins arranged in a half circle around a chair. Each mannequin wore real clothes, faded dresses, torn blouses, and old cardigans. But what made the scene unbearable was that the mannequins were not entirely fake. Every single one had human hair, fingernails, and teeth all crudely attached. Someone had tried to make them lifelike, yet their faces were blank, their eyes hollow like a failed attempt to rebuild the dead. Pinned above each figure was a photograph of a woman, cut from newspapers or printed in black and white. Many of the names matched missing persons from nearby counties, some gone for years. The owner of the cabin was identified as Harold Price, a reclusive handyman who disappeared in 1997. He was quiet, polite, and never in trouble, the kind of man who could live beside you for 20 years and leave no trace behind. Investigators searched the rest of the property and found a generator still hooked to a camera mounted on a tripod, aimed directly at the mannequins. There were dozens of videotapes stacked neatly beside it, each labeled with a date and a name. When the tapes were played, the sound was worse than the images. Harold's voice filled the dark room, whispering each name slowly over and over before saying the same chilling phrase, "Now you're home." In the freezer were glass jars filled with preserved fragments of hair and teeth, tagged with initials. DNA testing confirmed that they belonged to women who had vanished across the state between 1992 and 1997. Their bodies were never found. One of the jars contained a lock of blonde hair labeled KT, a match to a young teacher named Karen Tate, who had disappeared after her car was found abandoned near the same forest. Another was marked EM, tied to a missing nurse named Elaine Marks. Detectives pieced together what they could from old receipts, tool orders, and a hidden storage locker found in a nearby town. Harold had purchased mannequins over several years, each one corresponding to a missing woman. He rented the cabin under a false name and wired it, so no one could see inside or hear a sound from within. But the most unsettling discovery came from a final tape dated March 3, 1997, the same week Harold vanished. The footage showed the room as it had been found, but one mannequin was missing. The camera tilted down slowly to show Harold's shadow moving toward the empty chair. Then the tape ended. The case never officially closed. No trace of Harold Price was ever discovered. No fingerprints outside his own, and no sign of struggle. But every year when spring thawed the forest, hikers swore they could still smell the same sour odor drifting through the trees. Faint but unmistakable, as if the cabin never truly stopped breathing. The townspeople avoided the area, and even decades later the property remained unsold. Some said Harold never left at all, that he simply joined the collection, becoming the final figure in the room with no light. In 2006, when deputies from the Missouri State Police were called to check on the Murphy family, they expected a routine welfare visit. The Murphys, John Ellen, and their 2 teenage children, hadn't been seen in over a year. Their mail stacked high, grass grew wild, and their 2 cars sat unmoved in the driveway. The neighbors assumed they had moved away. But no one ever saw a moving truck or a goodbye. When police forced open the back door, the first thing that hit them was the smell of decay mixed with the faint sweetness of mildew. The interior looked as if it had been frozen in time. Dinner plates still sat on the table, a pot half full of water remained on the stove, and a clock on the wall ticked, somehow still running on old batteries. The upstairs bedrooms looked untouched. Beds were made, clothes hung neatly in closets, and the children's rooms were filled with toys that hadn't been touched in years. But something about the silence felt wrong. When officers stepped into the basement, the air changed. It was colder, heavier, and wet. A single bulb swung from the ceiling, its light flickering across a room that seemed oddly small for a house that size. One officer tapped on the far wall, and the sound came back hollow. They pried off a section of wood paneling and revealed a hidden door, with a latch nailed shut from the outside. When it opened, What lay behind it was unlike anything they had ever seen. Inside the hidden room were 4 chairs arranged in a circle, bolted to the concrete floor. On the wall, a small television was playing a looping home video: birthday parties, Christmas mornings, summer picnics. The sound of laughter filled the room, echoing faintly against the cold concrete. But seated in those chairs were the mummified remains of the Murphy family, still dressed in the clothes they wore in the video. The mother's hand rested on her husband's arm. The children's heads were tilted slightly toward the screen. None of them looked to have moved for a very long time. Nearby, a small notebook lay on the ground. The handwriting inside belonged to John Murphy, the father. The first few pages were simple journal entries, grocery lists, weather updates, but gradually his words grew darker. He wrote about losing his job, about arguments that turned violent, and finally about his fear of being separated from his family. The last entries were almost illegible, written in shaky pen strokes. He claimed that God had told him to keep the family together forever. The final entry read, "Tonight we'll finally stay home." Toxicology tests later confirmed that they had been poisoned with a high dose of sedatives mixed into their food. John's body wasn't found in the hidden room. Officers discovered him in the upstairs bedroom, lying on the bed, a gun still in his hand. It appeared he had stayed alive long enough to build the hidden wall and set up the looping video before ending his life. Investigators noted the eerie precision of it all, every detail arranged to preserve the illusion of family unity. There were no signs of outside interference, no struggle, no forced entry. Neighbors later told police they occasionally saw lights flicker in the basement window late at night, always at the same time, 8:07 p.m. It was the exact moment, according to the timestamp on the video, when the family would sing "Happy Birthday" to the youngest child. For years after the discovery, officers who visited the property reported hearing faint music whenever they entered the basement, though the television had long since been removed. The house still stands empty and unsold, its front door chained shut. Locals say if you drive past after dark, you might see a glow flickering behind the boarded windows, as if the Murphys are still down there watching themselves, waiting for the next family dinner that will never come. In 2011, a real estate agent named Dana Holt was preparing an old foreclosed property for sale on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. The house sat at the end of a long, cracked driveway surrounded by overgrown grass and rusting garden tools. It had been abandoned for almost a decade. But Dana wasn't easily unsettled. She had seen plenty of neglected homes. Still, as she walked toward the front door, she thought she heard something strange, a faint whispering sound, almost like wind but rhythmic, deliberate. When she stopped moving, the sound stopped too. When she took another step, it started again. It seemed to come from beneath her feet. She assumed it was air escaping through cracks in the concrete or perhaps a broken pipe. But when she mentioned it to a maintenance worker later that week, he heard it too. Both of them bent down, pressed their ears to the ground, and swore they could hear voices, muffled, distant, and overlapping, as if several people were whispering at once. Dana called local authorities, reporting a possible gas leak, but what they found when they broke up a section of the driveway turned the property into one of the state's darkest mysteries. Beneath the concrete was a shallow pit filled with dozens of sealed plastic containers, each the size of a small lunchbox. Inside were cassette tapes, every one labeled in black marker with a date and a set of coordinates. The earliest tape was from 1996, the latest from 2008. When investigators played the first few, what they heard made several of them leave the room. Each recording began the same way, with the faint hum of a car engine, followed by a voice, always the same calm male voice, asking, "Do you remember where we met?" Then came the sound of crying, sometimes a man, sometimes a woman, sometimes a child. The recordings ended abruptly with long stretches of silence, as if the tape had kept running after the microphone was dropped. Forensics teams cross-referenced the coordinates written on the tapes. Every location matched a missing person case from somewhere in Utah or a neighboring state. 7 cases in total aligned perfectly. The people in those cases had vanished without a trace over a span of 12 years. None of their remains had ever been recovered. It wasn't long before investigators linked the property to a man named Clyde Rowe, who had owned the land until 2008. Rowe had been a highway maintenance supervisor, responsible for rest stops, roadside cameras, and repair stations across several counties. He lived alone, no family, no friends, and disappeared 2 years before the discovery of the tapes. When detectives followed his paper trail, they discovered something unsettling. During his employment, Rowe had filed multiple travel logs showing he was on site at nearly all the locations marked on the cassette labels, always within days of a reported disappearance. Yet there was no evidence of abduction, no witnesses, and no fingerprints. His truck was eventually located at the bottom of a nearby lake, its doors locked from the inside. Inside the glove compartment was a note written in the same handwriting as the tape labels. It said, "They all came to me willingly." Audio specialists who analyzed the tapes noticed one final disturbing pattern. The whispering sounds heard beneath the driveway, those same ghostly murmurs Dana first described, were present faintly in the background of every recording, almost like an echo from the same spot. When investigators compared the acoustic signatures, they realized the voices on the tapes were recorded in that very driveway, perhaps even underground. No trace of human remains was found on the property, and the origin of the whispering was never explained. Some theorized it was the sound of air escaping through the empty containers, but others believed the soil itself held something that couldn't be measured, something left behind by the victims. The property was later paved over, sold and rebuilt, yet every new owner reported the same thing: when the sun set and the air cooled, the driveway whispered again. And if you listened too long, the voices began to form words, pleas, names, and faint laughter that didn't belong to the living. In 2015, a retired couple named Walter and June Miller were driving through the quiet desert highways of Arizona when they decided to stop for the night at a small roadside motel. It was the only place for miles, a faded two-story building with a flickering neon sign that simply reads Sunset Inn. The parking lot was empty except for a single old pickup truck. The front office had no clerk, just a bell on the counter and a note taped to the register that said, "Room 12 is ready." The key was already hanging on a hook beneath it. Exhausted and too tired to question it, the Millers took the key and checked themselves in. The room was old but clean. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something metallic, like rust. A single painting hung above the bed, a landscape of desert hills faded by time. Everything seemed normal until around 3 in the morning, when Walter woke to a faint scratching sound behind the headboard. It was steady and soft, like nails dragging on wood. Thinking it was an animal, he turned on the lamp and pressed his ear against the wall. The scratching stopped. A few minutes later it started again, this time closer to the floor, followed by a faint, rhythmic tapping. June slept through it, and Walter eventually convinced himself it was just the pipes or desert rats. They left at dawn without mentioning it to anyone. Later that morning, they stopped at a small diner down the road. While chatting with a local police officer, Walter brought up the strange sounds from the motel, half joking that it might be haunted. The officer frowned. He told them the motel had been closed for nearly a year after a series of complaints from guests who had heard whispers and scratching from inside their walls. No one had been able to reach the owner for months. Disturbed, the officer decided to check it out himself. When police arrived at the motel, the office looked exactly as the Millers had described it. The key to room 12 was gone from its hook. Inside the room, everything appeared normal at first glance, but when they removed the headboard, they found a small, square hole cut into the drywall. Behind it was a narrow crawl space that ran the length of the building. The space was lined with makeshift plywood walls, and in several sections, holes had been drilled, each about the size of a coin, perfectly positioned to look into the rooms. Old extension cords ran along the floor, leading to a basement that had been sealed shut. When officers pried the door open, they found a small room filled with broken monitors, tangled cables, and a dusty reel-to-reel recorder. A shelf held dozens of VHS tapes labeled with room numbers and dates. Many of them showed grainy, night vision footage of guests sleeping, recorded without their knowledge. Some tapes had been rewound and played repeatedly, wearing down the image quality to almost nothing. But others were worse. They showed empty rooms, filmed for hours at a time, with occasional flashes of movement. Someone crawling within the walls, pressing their hands against the thin wood that separated them from the sleeping guests. In one corner of the basement lay a bedroll, food wrappers, and a torn shirt belonging to a missing hitchhiker last seen checking into the motel months earlier. His wallet and ID were buried in a shoebox under the floorboards. The motel's owner, an elderly man named Gerald Tuck, was nowhere to be found. His pickup truck, the same one the Millers had seen, was later discovered abandoned behind an old gas station 20 miles away. Investigators learned that Gerald had once been a photographer, obsessed with capturing real moments. He had bought the motel in the 1980s and lived there alone after his wife died. Guests reported that he often wandered around with a camera, filming sunsets and strangers, claiming he was building a collection. No one realized how literal that was. After the discovery, the motel was shut down permanently. But people who drive past it at night say they sometimes see the faint blue glow of a TV flickering behind the boarded windows of room 12. And if you listen carefully, you can still hear the slow, steady scratching from inside the walls. In the winter of 1984, a violent blizzard swept across the northern edge of Alaska and exposed something long buried beneath the ice. A team of snowplow workers clearing an abandoned road near the coast noticed several wooden crosses sticking up from the frozen ground, uneven and half covered by snow. At first, they assumed it was an old cemetery, but when investigators returned after the thaw, they realized these graves weren't marked like ordinary ones. Each cross had only a first name and a number carved beneath it, 14 in total. There were no last names, no dates, and no records of any cemetery ever existing in that area. The discovery led researchers to a settlement once known as St. Enoch, a remote village wiped from most maps decades earlier. The population had once been small, barely 100 residents, mostly trappers and fishermen. The village had been abandoned mysteriously in the mid-1980s, with no clear explanation for why everyone left. Most of the buildings had collapsed from snow and age, except for one, a wooden church, its steeple bent but still standing. When the investigation team entered, the air inside was stale, and the floor was lined with snow that had drifted through the broken windows. At the front of the room sat an altar covered in dust and candles melted into unrecognizable shapes. Behind the pulpit was a large wooden chest, sealed with a chain and padlock. When the lock was cut, the chest revealed dozens of small toys, hair ribbons, and hand-drawn pictures. Each drawing showed the same thing: a tall man with no face, wearing a long black coat, standing beside a swing set. Some of the drawings had names written in shaky handwriting: Emily, Thomas Ruth. None of the names appeared in census or school records for the village. In fact, the most disturbing detail came when investigators combed through archives. There had been no recorded children living in St. Enoch during the time the graves were dated. The town's only school had closed years earlier due to lack of enrollment. The surviving records named the last known religious leader in the area as Pastor Elijah Crane, a man described in old letters as devoted and charismatic. He had moved to St. Enoch from Anchorage in the late 1970s and quickly became the heart of the community. Parishioners described him as a caretaker for the lost, often traveling to nearby towns to adopt orphans and bring them to the settlement for proper raising. None of those children were ever seen again. Crane vanished in 1985 after a massive storm cut off access to the region for weeks. When rescuers finally reached the village, it was empty. Every door was left open, every home stripped bare. The only sign of life was a single line of footprints leading from the church into the forest, where they disappeared. Inside Crane's old quarters, investigators found a ledger filled with lists of children's names paired with biblical references and numbers. Each name matched one of the crosses in the graveyard. The final entry simply read, "They are with him now. My work is complete." Locals from nearby settlements spoke of strange lights seen in the woods at night and faint laughter carried by the wind. Some believed the pastor had led the children into the forest to die, others that he had buried them himself as part of some twisted ritual. No remains were ever recovered from the graves. Each coffin was empty, filled only with toys and folded clothing. Over the years, attempts to rebuild the area were quietly abandoned. Construction crews reported power failures, equipment malfunctions, and eerie sounds echoing through the trees after dark. The site was eventually sealed off, and the name St. Enoch was erased from most modern maps. Yet pilots who fly over that part of Alaska at night have reported seeing faint lights below, tiny flickers in the snow, lined up like a row of candles. And when the wind shifts just right, it carries a sound no one has been able to explain: the distant, haunting melody of children singing softly beneath the ice. A song that ends the moment you try to listen too closely.